Good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program, 25 Hours in a Day, The Life of Jo Mora, presented by Peter Hiller. My name is Kevin Kosick and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar. We have more than 70 people joining us for this presentation, so for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much more. If you are not a member, or if your membership has lapsed, and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we frankly cannot do what we do without the support of our members. I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the book club. Now for tonight's program, 25 Hours in a Day, The Life of Jo Mora. Jo Mora was one of the first American artists to elevate the cultural importance of the Western frontier, presaging broad shifts in 20th century thought and expression. Through his celebration of the great glories of nature and of the human heart, Mora reminds us that the subject matter of all art is life. Tonight, you will hear the story of Jo Mora and his rich creative career, including his writing, printing, and publishing efforts. As curator of the Jo Mora Trust and a lifelong devotee of Mora's art, Peter Hiller, tonight's speaker, is widely recognized as the foremost authority on Jo Mora. He has lived a career in the visual arts, teaching art and photography for almost 40 years. Raised in West Los Angeles, he earned his BA from experimental Johnston College and his teaching credential from UCLA. Peter Hiller wrote what is considered to be the definitive biography of our subject this evening. The Life and Times of Jo Mora, iconic artist of the American West, was published by the Book Club of California in 2019. If you have questions for our speaker this evening, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have some time near the end of the hour to take questions, and I will curate those from the Q&A. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Peter Hiller and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Peter.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was a very elegant introduction. I'm humbled. I'm also very pleased came to my attention that this is the first webinar that the book club has done. And so just by coincidence, I think I'm the one that ends up doing the presentation, but it's a wonderful step on the part of the book club to keep all of us engaged during these unsettling times. I was struck as the other day as I was thinking about the whole idea of webinars, I kind of harked back to the days of radio and thinking of people gathered around a radio, you know, listening to whatever it happened to be that was being broadcast. And for you, I guess you can see me, but I can't see any of you. So for me, it's like looking into the radio, and I'm just trusting that you are all there. And I hope you enjoy the time that we have together. The title of this comes from another idea that occurred to me at some point when I was thinking about Jo Mora and the work that he did over the course of his life. And at some point, it's overwhelming. And the idea that he just packed more than 24 hours into a day is what came to mind. And I will be curious to see by the end of the presentation if that resonates with you and if you think that in fact, it was a pretty amazing life that he led. So I would be remiss not to start with a shout out to the book club. This is the title page of the book that was printed, as Kevin mentioned, in October. And it was absolutely, it was a culmination of almost 25 years of my work in terms of Jo Mora. And he's somebody that when I started to learn about him, I got more and more intrigued, more and more fascinated with his life and his accomplishments. And to be able to actually publish a book about that was just so flat. I'm so grateful to the book club having undertaken this extensive publication. I mean, it's a serious book, and there were 2 versions produced. They are still available for purchase, and they were all numbered, of course, in the style of the book club, and limited edition. And I've not heard a discouraging word about the book since it went off into the world. So I thank the book club from the bottom of my heart for this opportunity. So the book was published in October of 2019. We did a book talk in Los Angeles shortly. It was January of this year for members who live in Southern California. And the thinking was that we were going to do an exhibit at the book club of kind of the ephemeral material of Jo Mora, focusing on his book writing, his printing, as Kevin mentioned, and anything kind of paper related seemed to be in keeping with the theme of the book club itself, and then also that part of Jo Mora's life. So of course, we had to make a major shift once COVID and sheltering in place became part of our life. So that exhibit will still happen at some point. We're not sure yet when that will be. It could be as far out as a year from now, in deference to the other exhibits that were on the calendar and things. So, but someday we will come back to you with that exhibit at the book club in San Francisco. And that will be accompanied by what I will call a gallery talk. So as opposed to a presentation like this, I would look forward to an in-person opportunity to be with people at the book club and to actually go through the exhibit and maybe, share anecdotes or answer questions and talk about the material that is in that display. So rest assured, and Kevin will get the word out when that happens, and I'm looking forward to that. So in the meantime, what I want to do is tell you about Jo Mora. And we're going to start off with an old picture of his family. And if this works, I'm hoping you're seeing this. This is Jo's brother, Luis. This is Jo Mora at probably about 15 to 17 years old. This is his father, Domingo. Domingo was a trained sculptor. Luis was a trained painter. And this is their mom, Jo's mom. And the other people in the picture, I think, are from the Bacardi family, who had a distant relationship with the Mora family as far as their family tree and stuff was concerned. This photograph would have been taken on the East Coast of the United States. Jo was born actually in Uruguay. He was 2 years younger than his older brother, Luis. The family lived there for a couple of more years and then moved back to Spain for a little short period of time, and then came back to the United States. And Jo grew up on the East Coast, and he spent time in New Jersey, in Boston, in New York. His father followed work. And so the commissions, he actually went to Uruguay with the idea in mind of understanding the culture there, but also seeking work. And I think after there was political unrest at the time, we're talking about about 1880. And so the family decided it was time to move away. And then again, they ended up on the East Coast of the United States. And that's where Jo grew up. He went through grade school. He did go to art school. However, I think it's fair to say that his father was probably his most important teacher, and Jo started his artwork from the time he was a very young child. So we have two examples here. He wrote journals on a regular basis, and the image on the left is a title page from one of his small little notebooks. And it's so telling. These notebooks were very small. You can just picture him keeping them in his pocket and making entries on a daily basis in some cases, writing in tiny, tiny cursive, and recording his thoughts. And more than his thoughts, it was the activities of the day. So that, which is kind of, for biographers, a little bit frustrating, because I would have longed for more insight into what he was thinking. He was great at recording what he was doing, but not necessarily always reflecting on what he was thinking about what he was doing. The image on the right, sketches from art class. So you can see this is follows the adage of that if you understand the basics of something in terms of art and you get the foundation down, you can then explore based on your own imagination. And so I think is a very good example of his ability to work really well with anatomy and structure of bones and the actual natural world. Part of the curriculum for his grade school teaching at the time was map making. And we're going to see later how this affected his work in the later years of his life. But this is probably from the time he was in the 5th or 6th grade. I've come to discover that that was just a regular part of the social studies curriculum, was map making. And so here's his version of Europe, which again, very accomplished, and probably done maybe from looking at a map, but it also could have been just from his recollection and imagination. Once he was finished with school, he went to work. And his first job was working for the Boston Herald as an illustrator. And you have to imagine that these are the days before photography was a factor in newspapers. So the editor would send the staff illustrator out into the field to record in drawings whatever the news event happened to be. And so the image on the left was a boat that ran into trouble down in the Cape Cod area. Another more kind of documentary image on the right of the Harvard varsity football team. A picture at a gallery exhibition, which I love just because it's an art club, and then Jo as an artist is there depicting the art club. So this was his first job. He was very successful. It generated income for him, which he was able to save. And then he also ended up doing book illustrations. And this is an example of one of those. And what often happened at the time was publishers would reissue books like Hans Christian Andersen's Tales. And each time they did that, they looked to a new illustrator to get a fresh look, a fresh approach to whatever the book subject happened to be. And so again, this was right around the same time, and we're talking the late 1800s, maybe 1901. And so Jo does a number of books at that time. He didn't write the books, but at that time, but he did illustrate them. And at some point, he had the opportunity to see the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. And this is also from a very small little notebook that he had. And it's Wild Bill Cody. Now, this was kind of a pivotal moment for Jo. He grew up with an interest in the Wild West, and a number of his childhood journals and stories he wrote and stories he illustrated as a child had to do with what I will call cowboys and Indians, because that's what the vernacular for the times would have been. And it was a very deep interest on his part. And I think Bill Cody just kind of ignited that further interest, and to the point where Jo said, okay, I'm going west. I need to see this for myself. He was about 25, 27 years old at the time. And so he set off on his own. He had money in his pocket from his work income. He also left money in the bank, which he knew he could write to his parents and they could send bank drafts out to him. But he got on the train, stopped in Chicago along the way, and ended up in California. Part of his initial goal in going west was to see the Hopi snake dance. And we're going to come back to that, but he got all the way to California. He knew people there in the San Jose area. And so he visited with them, and then he ended up settling in the San Ynez Valley. So this image is from a notebook a sketchbook that he had. And it is, in fact, the San Ynez Valley. So this became kind of one of his first deep learning experiences. And he spent a number of months there. He lived on the Donahue Ranch, which is just outside of the San Ynez Mission area. And he learned the ways of the vaquero. He would do his artwork at different times, of which this is another example from the sketchbook. He learned to ride. He learned the nomenclature of all the tack and saddles. He just absorbed all of this from firsthand experience. And so it wasn't book learning for Jo at this point. It was really the actual experience of learning what the life of the vaquero was like. And this time would be pivotal later in his life when he writes a book about that we'll see soon. So while he was there, he had in mind he was going to head back to Arizona to see the snake dance. Well, as happenstance would take us, he missed the snake dance. The snake dance does not follow the Gregorian calendar. And so he came to realize that he had missed it. So then he found himself still in California with kind of a year, more or less, to wait before he could go back to Arizona to actually see the snake dance. Well, not to be left twiddling his thumbs, he decided to see what adventures he could get into on the El Camino Real. So I want you to picture, this is 1903. He buys a horse. Her name is Lady. He rides Lady over the San Marcos Pass, down from the San Ynez Valley down to Santa Barbara. They get on a boat in Santa Barbara and sail down to San Diego. They get off the boat, turn around, and he rides the El Camino Real from San Diego up to San Juan Bautista. Now, also picture that he has a saddlebag, two saddlebags. He has his paints with him. He has his sketchbooks. He has one of the first Kodak cameras, and he has a journal along with his bedroll and hopefully a change of underwear. And off he goes by himself to ride the El Camino Real. I should point out, he also had a copy of Crespi's diary, and it was in Spanish, but that was not a problem for Jo. Jo ended up speaking 7 languages. His father was Catalan, so Spanish came naturally to him. His mother was French. That also came naturally to him, and of course, at the time, English. So the translation of the diary was not a problem for Jo. And so what we have here is a photograph that he took of the San Diego mission, and then the watercolor that he did in his sketchbook of that same scene. And it's what's missing here is the journal, which was written on a daily basis and explained exactly what he did during the course of that given day. So there's this wonderful one-to-one correspondence between the artwork he did and the entries he made in the journal. And at this particular site at San Diego, the comment that stands out was him sitting on a rock doing his painting and having to swat the damn flies. This is a little further north. These are the mission bells at Mission San Juan Capistrano. Same idea, but what I want you to notice too, totally different art medium here. Here he's using just pencil. And the sketchbook, which fortunately still exists and is just spectacular primary source material, as is the journals, are just wonderful to look through. And there's really no two pages that are exactly alike, in fact, in terms of the technique, the artistic technique. He gets a little further north. These details were done at the San Miguel mission as he was riding north. So I find it very intriguing that his eye was drawn not only to the large details, you know, an entire building, but also the smaller details of interiors and windows and furniture and things. These were the, these probably fit in a different, slightly different category, similar because they're missions, but these are down in Baja California. And there's kind of a conflicting story about whether he actually went down there himself or not. I'm not convinced that he did. However, he at least found some source material to look at to be able to do these watercolors, which were done for a production company called the Mindenberg Productions. And they hired Jo to do these along with some other pieces so that they could use them as set information while they were filming a movie. So he gets back up, he goes, as I mentioned, all the way up to San Juan Bautista, and then heads back down to San Ynez for a little while, and then still has a little bit of time to kill. It's too soon to go to Arizona. So he heads back up to San Jose and then up to the Sierras. And you just keep in the back of your mind, he's kind of exploring California in a very intimate way and without any problems, doing it on his own. And so off he goes. And he starts to think about possibility of prospecting for gold. And this is, I only know this because he writes about it in the journals, but he captures the scenes that he witnesses up there in the gold country and spends a short, modest amount of time there. And then finally realizes it's time to head to Arizona. So he goes back to San Jose. He meets up with a friend of his from the East Coast, Honey Williams, and the two of them set off on a buckboard wagon, a Studebaker wagon with two mules, Tom and Jerry, hopefully named after the cocktail. And off they go across the Central Valley and into Yosemite. And so this is the summer of 1904. And they end up getting to Yosemite and spend about 2 weeks in the valley. And again, Jo's writing about it. He's doing artwork there. He's hiking. He does an amazing hike from the valley floor up to Glacier Point and then back down again in a matter of hours. When I explained this to Forest Service workers up in Yosemite, their jaw dropped at how fast he did that hike, which usually takes 8 or 9 hours. And he did it at 4 or 5. But that's just kind of the type of guy he was. He kept lists of the birds he saw in Yosemite. They happened to be there over the 4th of July. They played baseball, with other people that were in the park. It was a big 4th of July celebration. And it was really, what I loved is that even though he was heading to Arizona, he took the time to spend about 2 weeks in Yosemite and really captured the flavor of it, and was actually ended up leaving, but having been very impressed with what he saw. So finally he gets to Arizona and he does see the snake dance. This is a picture of him probably at Hubbell's Trading Post, and he became good friends with the Hubbells. He met another artist, E.A. Burbank, and they ended up living together. Jo spent time living in Nampeyo's house. Those of you that are familiar with Nampeyo, she's probably the first named potter of Hopi descent and created magnificent work based on the historic pottery of the Hopi. And at the time, the government had set aside housing for some of the Hopi, and what she did was rented out her housing to Jo and Burbank, and then she went and lived on the mesa in her ancestral home. So it was a source, Jo became a source of income for her while he was there. But what you have to realize is that Jo, he ended up spending almost 3 years there. And his time there was so significant that he learned to speak Hopi, he learned to speak Navajo. He ended up being included in a ceremony with the Hopi. He ended up taking Navajo tribal members on hunting trips where Jo was the hunting guide, which is not the way I would originally thought it happened. And he, again, learned both of their languages and created some absolutely phenomenal artwork while he was there. He did very few oil paintings. So we're looking at sort of a gouache here and a very loose watercolor. Then he does an oil painting with the Navajo riders. This is based on a Sienna type photograph Jo took of just the landscape. So he reproduced the landscape and then he inserted the riders. And then what the most outstanding sort of suite of work that he did were about 40 drawings of Hopi Kachina figures. And these are two examples of those images. And when I saw these, I kind of fell hook, line, and sinker in love with Jo's work and him as a person. He'd interested me previously, but I had never seen paintings as elegant as these were of Kachina figures. And I had a pre-existing interest in Hopi cultural material. I grew up with it. I have Kachina figures hanging on my walls and have since I was a kid. So I had a sense of what I was looking at, and these just absolutely knocked me out. And so it was kind of at that point that I realized I'm in this for the long haul, and I just want to learn as much about this person as I can. These images, the original watercolors, are now in the Smithsonian in Washington. And I hope someday they will again be on display. I'm not sure if that will happen or not, but they're just beautiful, beautiful pieces. One of the stories that is told is that when Jo originally did these, he came to realize that the Hopi had changed parts of their, what they were wearing. And when he realized that it wasn't as authentic as he wanted it to be, he tore those all up and said, okay, we're going to do it again. And he again paid people to pose for him, and he redid the entire suite of paintings. Well, while he's there, we're talking about 1906 or so, he gets a commission to do a series of cartoons for the Boston Herald. He does the illustrations, he writes the limericks, and it creates a source of income for him where he wasn't necessarily making any money while he was in Arizona. So this was a commission that came his way based on his previous work there. He accepted the commission. It was imagine this as a full page cartoon in the Boston Herald on a Sunday. So whereas we're used to kind of having maybe 3 or 4 different cartoons on a page on a Sunday, Jo got the whole page, and these ran for about 52 weeks. He started it while he was in Arizona, and then he finished it when he moved back to California. And he had met a woman in San Jose who would become his wife. And they were married in January of 1907 in Ocean Park, California. And so the quails represent Joe's return to California, and that is where he spent the rest of his life. So they didn't spend a lot of time down in Southern California. They moved up to, and Joe bought a ranch in Mountain View. There actually still is a Mora Lane near that property. And he set up a studio in San Francisco, which, as best as I've been able to tell, is where part of the Macy's buildings are, right at Union Square, and set about to work. And if part of what I'm going to show you now has to do with Joe's work in proximity to where the book club is. So if you were at the book club right now, you could probably throw a rock and hit the Vickery, Atkins, and Torrey building where that exhibit of Joe's was. And it's wonderful to, I've led a walking tour. And we started near Nob Hill, and we end up down near the Hilton, near Mason, but I'll tell you more about that in a minute. On the image on the right is a marble piece that Joe did that was part of the Panama Pacific exhibit in 1915. Joe was one of the judges at the exhibit, so he could only display his work. He didn't, his work was not in the competitions there. So then we go back, and so imagine him working now in his studio in San Francisco. This is an old postcard which shows two very small, petite plaster pieces that he did, the bear cub and the pub scratching. Oftentimes, Joe would work in plaster, initially work in plaster, and then unless he sold something, he often didn't cast it in bronze. I think it was always a concern about the cost. And so if it was sold, that was fine. They'd go ahead and do the last step. But if not, he would keep it as a plaster. And what happened was, and this is another example of a piece, this, to my knowledge, was never cast in bronze. And what happened was he did a number of pieces, and we're now in, say, 1915 in San Francisco. And he then enlisted and went into training for the First World War. Before he left, he decided he didn't trust that if he didn't come back, he didn't trust that anybody would properly cast the work that he did. So he actually destroyed all of these plaster pieces that he had at the time. A few of them he's kind of redone since he came back, but fortunately we have photographs of a number of these pieces. This is one example. Gabriel Mulan, who was the photographer of the day in San Francisco and has a wonderful historic archive, was the photographer for this series for Joe. And so at least we do have the photographic record of these. What also happened for Joe while he was in San Francisco was he was given membership into the Bohemian Club. And I'm going to try and circle him right here. This is Joe in the bar at the club. It was something he sought after with a great deal of fervor, his membership. And he knew, either instinctively or from just, talking to meeting people, how important membership in the club could be. And in fact, it served him well throughout the entire rest of his life. He was a member for the rest of his life. He participated in the Jinx. He would go spend time in the Grove. And the people he met are, probably the most important part of his membership. This is another photograph of Joe. He's the one sitting cross-legged on the ground in the front. And what I love about this picture is a couple of things. One is I am convinced that the sculptural piece that's in the middle of the picture of the back row was done by Joe, simply because the cow there with the chaps on and the bandana is perfectly in keeping with the style of work that Jo did when he personified animals. And then also what I love about this picture is he's considerably younger than the rest of the members in the club, which for the most part. And I think that was pretty interesting. I think it says a lot about him in terms of his character and his abilities that he would be included in the club. This is a fountain at Villa Montavo in Saratoga. Villa Montavo was the home, one of the homes of Senator James Phelan. And Phelan and Jo worked on this together. Jo did the bronze at the bottom. Phelan wrote the poem that's on the top. So again, important connection from the Bohemian Club that led to a commission of work. And Phelan actually at some point loaned Jo money. And this is a perfect time to point out that Jo never had income other than from his artwork. And those of you familiar with the arts know how rare it is that an artist would make their sole source of income from their artwork. It's really says something about his drive and his interest and his resourcefulness. And Phelan at times, and it wasn't always, Jo wasn't always flush in terms of money, and had to borrow at times, and Phelan always came through for him. As did Samuel Morris, who's on the right. This is we're jumping ahead a little time-wise, but it's another benefactor that Jo met as a result of the Bohemian Club. Morris would go on to develop the Hotel Del Monte and then eventually Pebble Beach, and they would become good friends, and we'll get to some of that again. And then the piece that's on the left is Archbishop Reardon, and I throw that out there thinking that maybe a lot of you are from San Francisco, and this was a bronze piece that was displayed somewhere in San Francisco, and I have not been able to track it down. And maybe somebody that's watching this happens to know where it is. I doubt that it would have been destroyed, but, and it's not that big. It was maybe 24 inches tall, I think. And it was done, of course, in honor of Reardon. But, you know, if anybody knows, let me know. And we're going to stay in the San Francisco area. These two pieces, the last time I was in the De Young Museum, these were upstairs as part of their permanent collection. I can't swear to it that they're still on display because it's been a while since I've been there. But again, and they've got this as circa 1910. Here again is with the Poppy Girl that we saw. Jo's working in marble. So we're seeing bronze, we're seeing marble, we're seeing watercolors, we're seeing pencil drawings, we're seeing what became bronze as bronze casts. And of course, this is based on his recollection of his time in Arizona. Jo would also do the decorative elements on numerous buildings. The picture on the left is an old postcard of the native Sons of the Golden West building on Mason. And it's hard to see it now, but if you look in the middle picture, you can see two of the panels above the door, and there were 6 of those, which you can count in the picture on the left that Jo did. And each one represented a different era of California history. And Jo absolutely loved California history, and it shows up as a theme in his work, you know, throughout his life once he got to California. But it's a little harder to see. On the middle picture are the medallions down along the side of the door, and those are historic figures in California history. And then one of my favorite family pictures is Jo working with his son Joey on one of those panels, and that's the image, excuse me, on the right. So this building is still there, of course. The exterior has been changed dramatically because now there is a theater marquee that kind of interferes with really getting a good view of the bottom part of the building, but it's still worth, you know, going for a walk and taking a look at it. This is the piece, a bronze piece that Jo did for the Bohemian Club. It is on the exterior of the building at Taylor and Gary, I think, and in honor of Bret Hart, illustrating numerous characters from Bret Hart's stories. This is a building that's now been repurposed, and this is on Bush. At the time that I took the picture at the bottom, it had been the California State Chamber of Commerce, but it also had been the curb exchange previous to that. And Jo is responsible for the capital piece that's up at the top, and that's what's enlarged above the building. What I love about what's happened here is this whole building has been repurposed and restored, and it's now in full use as an office building, but they also set up a beautiful history display in the lobby on the first floor that you're welcome to go in and take a look at. And it has, you know, the store, it depicts the history of the building. It's really, again, worth it if you're going for a walk. Now we move over to Van Ness, and this is the 1000 building on Van Ness. Jo did, again, the decorative elements. He's got the bears, and then also the automobile emblem and the wheels. This was the Cadillac building at some point, and the emblem is representative of that. And at some point, he's working with his dad on some of these projects, but his dad dies right around the 1917. And so that becomes a pivotal point for Jo in his life, where he realizes that he's on his own, but how much he loved sculpting. And I think if you were to ask him, you know, what was most dear to him in terms of art, the answer would be sculpting. And now we go up towards Nob Hill, and this is the building that is currently the Ritz-Carlton. It had been the Metropolitan Life Insurance building, and I believe something else before that, but again, Jo did the sculptural work that's up at the top. Yeah. Now we jump across the bay just to show you something he did in a residential home. And this is in Berkeley. It's the mantelpiece of a fireplace in a beautiful craftsman home. And he did this with his father. So they did a number of pieces together while they were both in the Bay Area. And then World War I rolls around. So Jo decides he's going to enlist, and he's going to go into officer training, which he does. He begins his training in San Rafael and ends up finishing it at Camp Zachary Taylor in Kentucky. He probably worked harder on that training than he had on anything else in his life. And again, I say this as a result of a large stack of letters that he wrote home at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning after he had finished his studying. And he had to work hard because it was difficult work. And he didn't have a college education, so he was really teaching himself everything he needed to learn. Consequently, he did very little artwork during that period of time. This is one of the few examples of anything he did. And there's a couple of interesting twists to the story in a way. One is that, and you have to picture that he is probably 35 years old when he goes into this training. So he's twice as old as most of the other people in the training. And he ends up graduating first in his class. And so that, I think, is an indication of how hard he worked and how dedicated he was to what he did. But then the ultimate irony was that just as he finished his training, literally within days, the war ended. And whereas in my thinking, that would have been what a relief. I get to go home. But in fact, he wrote a letter to his wife that brings tears to your eyes about how disappointed he was at not being able to serve his country. And it's just heartbreaking. And what I love about it is it just is a totally different view of a situation than would have been my initial instinctive view. But he, so eventually, within days of that, he got over it. He did go home and lived happily ever after, but it's just a very poignant moment. The war the war effort made a big impact on him. This bench is at the base of Slater Tower on the Berkeley campus. It was a commission dedicated to the people in the community who had served in the war. And then a few years later, he does this heroic bronze that was initially at the City Hall in San Rafael, and it was eventually moved over to the Marin Civic Center, which is where it is today. Unfortunately, the rifle has been vandalized, so the current picture on the right, you can see where that's been broken off compared to the piece on the left. And we hop back to San Francisco because I want to point out another piece that Jo did. The image that's on the left is Cervantes with Pancho Sanchez and Don Quixote. This is just, I think, north, I would say, of the de Young Museum in Golden Gate Park. And there's 2 points to make here. One is that the image on the right is a sculpture in Uruguay, where Jo was born. And I think there's just an interesting kind of connection influence between the composition of the 2 pieces. The other point to make with the Cervantes is that if you were following the news of the last month, that piece was vandalized when the other sculptures were torn down in the area of the museum. And fortunately, it was just vandalized with paint. And I can only imagine that the people who did the vandalizing had no sense of history. There was absolutely no reason to be vandalizing this piece. And the best news is that the city workers were able to power wash and clean it, and it's back to normal now. It's been pretty interesting month as far as Jo Mora in the world of what's happening these days. And you'll get another sense of that soon. So, I want to go back. The Cervantes piece led to Jo's being commissioned to do a cenotaph in honor of Father Serra at the Carmel Mission. And so imagine that the family is still in San Francisco. Jo has 2 children by now, a son and a daughter. And the commission is given to him by Father Mestres, who's on the left. And Jo moves the family down to Carmel. He rents a house in Carmel. They set up a studio at the Carmel Mission, and he creates the cenotaph in honor of Father Serra. And to Jo, it was one of the supreme artistic accomplishments of his career at that point. And I think even in years after. It's largely done in kind of a European style. It's not the kind of thing you see in the States very often. And what you can't see in the photographs are the little brass pieces that surround the cenotaph. And they're very important in terms of storytelling, because and this is one of the things Jo did, was whenever he could, and he was often subject to committees. He was often, a commission would come along that he didn't necessarily have creative control over, although he often fought for creative control. But the bronze plaques tell a very good story about kind of the history of the indigenous people in California, and then the coming of the Jesuits and the Christians. And so it is a good vehicle for understanding a more complete picture of the history. Here we have a picture of Jo's family, his wife Grace, his son Joey, his daughter Patty. and they are dressed for the dedication of the cenotaph. That's Joey holding the flag and Patty, who's at least on my screen partially blocked. But then this was 1924. And so the family from that point on lived in the Monterey Bay area, either Carmel or eventually in Pebble Beach. One of the projects he did for Morris is the Father Sarah sculpture on the left. That is, if you've driven into Carmel off of Highway 1, if you went down Carpenter, you come to a big intersection, and this piece is kind of impossible to miss unless you go today, and it's gone. And it was taken down about 2 weeks ago as a safety measure, the thought being that it was ripe for being vandalized with all the other sculptures of Father Sarah that are coming down these days. I thought it was a prudent move to take it down. It has been vandalized in the past on at least 3 occasions, sometimes just as a jinx by high school students, other times as an act of protest. So they took it down. It's currently in storage, and the conversation eventually will take place as to what to do with it permanently. The curious thing about it is that it's an entire piece. It was not just the sculpture that was done by Joe. He did the awning above it with the tiles. He designed the base. The bench where he's sitting is one of 2 benches, and they're inscribed with a little bit of information about the piece. So it's kind of a whole piece, and it's kind of an intriguing question as to, do you just replace the statue part of it, the figure, or do you, dismantle the whole thing and try to move the whole thing? I think the biggest controversy of it right now is that it was on public land, and one of the easier solutions is to move it to private land, and possibly the Carmel Mission. I don't know if that conversation started, but it's all of a sudden these things are happening that revolve around Jo Mora's art, and the sad thing is that he's not here to describe it. I mean, I think it's very clear from his sensitivity in terms of and interest in the time he spent in Arizona. Had Morris said to him, I'd like to do some of the Rumsian people as a statue, Joe would have jumped at that opportunity as well. So it's just kind of an intriguing question right now. Well, once they moved to the community of Carmel, Joe got very involved in the community. That's him on the left, acting in a play called The Bad Man. He played in the Abalone Softball League, along with his daughter Patty. The teams had to be co-ed, and so I think that's kind of poetic justice that they played together. In 1925, he designed a commemorative, actual currency, but commemorative 50-cent piece for the California State Jubilee. And then, even though he was living down in the Monterey Peninsula area now, he continued to do commissions in San Francisco. And this is a postcard with 2 murals on it, top and the bottom, that were part of the decorative elements in the Fable restaurant at the Drake Wiltshire Hotel. Now, the Drake Wiltshire is now Campton Place. So the building has been, of course, remodeled, but that is the location, just to kind of put it in a context. And for many, many years, these murals, of which there were 7 of them altogether in the restaurant, were thought to be lost. And by wonderful turn of events, somebody had kept them when they were been removed from the hotel. That person knew somebody in the art business. That person was Terry and Paula Trotter, who owned 2 art galleries, one in Pacific Grove, one in Carmel. And they were able to purchase these murals, and they're now on display at their gallery in Pacific Grove. And when the time comes, I highly recommend you going down there. Not only are these murals glorious, but Terry's gallery is as good as most museums in California in terms of its display of California art. It's just fantastic. Plus a lot of material about Jo Mora. He did other murals. This is one of several that were about the Canterbury Tales. They were done for the Holy Names University, what's now Holy Names University, having been Holy Names College. So these are over in Oakland. However, they're kind of hard to find. They're in the Performing Arts Center downstairs, kind of in the backstage area. And I'm not quite sure why that's where they ended up, maybe because they're so big and there's so many of them, but if you can kind of wiggle your way down there, they're worth seeing as well. And then we come back around to his maps. So remember, we saw that childhood map that he did. This is arguably the first published map that Jo, or map of his that was ever published. It's the end paper for the book Dawn and the Dons, and it was done in about 1926, I think. And we have a picture of Jo working on one of his maps. His map making in the style of pictorial maps is probably what he is most recognized for. And one of the obvious reasons is because they were generally printed in the thousands, definitely in the hundreds, if not thousands. And so the distribution was much larger than a given bronze would have been. But he did this effortlessly. And his son Joey at the time, so now we're into the 30s, late 20s and into the 30s, and Joey would say, well, Dad, if you draw a picture, if you draw me a map of California, I'll take it and I'll sell it. And in fact, that's what they did. And it continued into the Depression. And for, you know, sort of the grace of the family, the people continued to buy these maps for 50 cents each, even though money was hard for everybody. And it really helped the family get through the Depression with a source of income. He did 3 national park carts. This is obviously his Yosemite cart. I would vouch for the image on the right being Jo and Honey coming down into the valley when they took on their buckboard with their mules. And what I love about this particular map is that it's got a number of what I call autobiographical vignettes on it, including Jo wiping his brow after having done the hike up to Glacier Point. And it's a really fun one to look at with the journal that he kept at the same time. And this map has stayed in the owner, he did this and sold it to what was the Curry Company probably initially, and then became the Yosemite Association, now is the Yosemite Conservancy. And they've continued to keep it in print for the very reasonable fee of $10. They also produced a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle of this image, and both of those you can find on their website. And then, so there we have him taking pictures in the middle image. He was not adverse to visual puns, and the image on the right is the woman at Mirror Lake, you know, powdering her nose as she's reflected in the lake. And then we have Jo and Honey at their camp, you know, in between activities. Back to Carmel and 3 sculptures that he did for the Ford family. And he actually asked the girls to pose for him, and he said he wasn't sure who had more fun, the girls posing or him, you know, engaging the girls while they posed. And then, not to be left undone, he also designs houses and buildings. So this one is the most well documented. This is a house in Monterey, and you can see from the blueprints that he was the designer of the building. Part of living in Carmel was the opportunity to know proprietors. He became good friends with Earl Graff, who at the time owned the Carmel Dairy. And Jo did artwork for Earl, one of which is this mural. he did 3 murals for him that were inside the dairy, which was kind of like a soda fountain at the time for milkshakes. And in exchange, Jo got cheese and milk and butter things. So it helped keep food on the table. Another example of the work he did for him. Very, very rare colored milk bottle. There are some others that are just black without the color that are equally as striking. And probably the 2 pieces that Jo is most well known for are his Sweetheart of the Rodeo on the left, or Evolution of the Cowboy, and then his Indians of North America on the right. And part of what I love about the image on the right is that a number of the artifacts that line the borders were Jo's personal, from his personal collection. That's one of the things he did while he was in Arizona, was he actually bought cultural material and he kept it. Somebody has, way back when, showed me a picture of the pot that's, let's see, it's down here, that actually resembled a pot by Nampeo in terms of the design, and that would make perfect sense. And so a lot of these items were things that Jo kept in his own personal collection. And the other point too, and just in terms of the composition of these and the amount of information that Jo is able to put onto a relatively small square inch area, they are constantly engaging for people. Every time I've watched people when these have been on display, nobody can walk by them without stopping and looking, and oftentimes coming back and looking again. And they're almost like books that there's so much information in them that you just keep coming back to them over and over again. Here he is adding the color to the Indians of North America. And then again, you can look over here to the right, and that knife shield is pictured in the final piece. As well as and this isn't pictured, but that's just fun to see another sculpture of Jo's in his work area. I would be remiss not to mention the dioramas he created. This one was at the Treasure Island World's Fair. It was the Portola expedition. It was 100 feet long in the California building. And one of the items in this right here, this shield, is depicted here. This is actually one of the shields that was kind of by happenstance saved. You probably know the story that the California building caught on fire within the last day of the fair, and this diorama was totally destroyed to the point where, I mean, the figures melted, and I mean, it was ruined. And the plan had been to save it and to re-display it either in Sacramento or down in Monterey. And of course, with the fire, that wasn't an option. But my guess is that this was probably an extra that hadn't been used, along with this bit. Same thing that there was maybe just an extra piece that was cast. And these are, in real life, these are actually real life, they're a little smaller than you see them right here. Couple of photographs of him in his studio. On the left, he's working on the Portola expedition diorama, and the scale of that project was so large that he had to hire artistic assistants to help him with it. And I had the pleasure of knowing 2 of them before they passed away, and interviewing them, and they just loved the experience of working with Jo. It was kind of life-changing for both of them. And then we have the picture on the right is actually 2 of the murals from the Drake Wilshire Hotel, the ones on the left. And then in back of Jo is a panel that's on the Monterey County Courthouse that we'll see in a minute. Here's the courthouse. This is in Salinas, California. And what I love about this picture is it shows the overall project. And the architect for this was Robert Stanton, who was a neighbor of Joe's in Pebble Beach. And the task at hand was to design a new courthouse, because the county had grown to the point where it had outlived the kind of Victorian courthouse that sits right here. And what Stanton figured out was a way to build the new building around the courthouse, because justice could not stop during the construction. So imagine, while this entire building is under construction, court is still taking place in this building. So they finally got to the point where they finished the new building. Joe had done all the decorative elements on it, of which there's numerous scenarios that are well worth walking around and taking a look at. So the new building's finished. They pass the furniture from the old building through the windows into the new building, and then board by board take apart the old courthouse. And what you end up with is what you see today. And this is a picture of the interior courtyard where the old building had been. These are heads that Joe designed. There's about 15 different ones, and they trace the history of California, starting with the indigenous people and going up to modern, what he called modern man and modern woman. This was a beautiful sculptural piece that's in the middle of the courtyard. This was one of 4 different door decorative pieces. You can see one there, just get an idea of how small they actually are. And then on the opposite wall are the 6 panels that again depict different eras in California history. And one of the nice things, this building just recently went through complete renovation, where they didn't structurally change it, but they repurposed it. So it's no longer used for courtrooms. It's now the district attorney's office and the Monterey County Law Library and the Monterey County Civil Grand Jury meeting room. And the little cafe that they built, they named after Joe. So it's called Joe's Cafe. Then they went down the road a little ways, and I should point out that that building, as well as this building, were both PWA projects. And this is the King City High School Auditorium. It was renamed the Robert Stanton Theater. And this is Joe in his studio with the 3 panels that would become, the 3 panels that would become the bottom 3 of the building that you can see there. And then we go to the Morris house, and I include this because I just think it would be pretty cool to wake up on Christmas morning and see these large paintings that my dad had done, who was my dad, of Santa Claus and the reindeer. And so a little more than just ornaments on a tree. Another example of a heroic bronze. This is one of 4 pieces that Joe did that are in Oklahoma. And another diorama. This is also in Oklahoma. Joe did 14 different scenes depicting the life of Will Rogers. And so this is Will Rogers singing to the cattle. And this gives you a sense of the scale of these. And these are still on display. They're little shoebox size. They're not very big, but they are still available to look at in Oklahoma. And I would be remiss not to mention that Joe was a writer. So I already kind of alluded to the fact that he wrote about the vaqueros, and that's the second book that he did, the one on the right, Californios. He wrote it and he illustrated it, as he did the book on the left, Trail Dust and Saddle Leather. And these were right at the end of his life. In fact, Californios, he finished it, but he didn't see to the publishing of it before he died in 1947. So his son Joey did that. And there was a plan for a 3rd book, which would have been about the gauchos of South America. And he just ran out of life and wasn't able to do that third one. But what's wonderful about these two books is that they are totally comfortable reads. It's just such a welcoming style of writing. It's almost as if you're sitting there in the living room with Joe and he's just telling you a story. And but yet they're equally factual and detailed accounts of the American cowboy and the vaquero. And they're still used as reference books today. They're out of print, but they're available on the aftermarket, and they're still good research material. Of course, if you write books and illustrate books, you have to make book plates as well for your children, which these are. And why stop at books for adults when you can also write and illustrate children's books, of which the only one that's been published is this, Budgie Budgie Cottontail. And he wrote that in the 30s, and Joey set about to get it published, and he went to every publisher from Chicago to Boston, and nobody would publish it at the time. And it kind of broke the family's heart. Joe did these beautiful, beautiful illustrations. He wrote the text. Some of the publishers criticized the text, and he rewrote it twice. He wrote it for a younger audience. He wrote it for an older audience, and he still couldn't find anybody to do it. And so, but Joey promised his dad he would see to it being published someday. And in fact, that happened. In the early 1990s, a gentleman by the name of David Stockline, who is a Western photographer, was before he passed away, and publisher up in Idaho. And David knew about Trail Dust and Saddle Leather and Californios, and he knew they were out of print. And so he approached Joey and said, well, would you be willing to let me reproduce those and republish them and just get them back out into the world again? And Joey, kind of quick as a whip, said, well, yeah, I would consider that if you are also willing to publish Budgie Budgie Cottontail. And Dave said, absolutely. So he was thrilled. I mean, he didn't bat an eye. And so all three books were done again. And Budgie now is almost out of print. Even Dave's reproductions are out of print again. And kind of last but not least, as far as Joe as a person's concerned, is that all the descriptors that go along with him, which are many, and we've seen examples of them, but he was also a cowboy. And those of you that know horses will recognize the hackamore on the horse. And I think to ride with a hackamore without a bit in the horse's mouth is kind of the ultimate skill and quality of a horseman, and that was how good Joe was. At that, and here he is. He's close to the end of his life here, and yet still sits a saddle pretty well, I think. A couple more quickies. This is Joe's work. That's at the Pacific House on the plaza in downtown Monterey. And I want to point out the figures that are there are based on drawings that Joe did. The state of California approached Joey. So this was after Joe had passed away, and they said, well, we'd like to use your dad's illustrations for part of the displays for the museum. And if you go in the museum, fully half the displays are based on Joe's drawings. And so Joey said, well, yes, but there's a fee involved. And they said, well, okay, well, what would that be? And he said, well, I don't want to pay California sales tax anymore, or income tax. And they actually agreed. And so I tried that on selling some other things to the state later on when I kind of took over what Joey was doing. And they said, no way, we're not doing that anymore. And Joe's work continues to live out in the wide, wide world. This is the visual that was created for the 2020 Monterey County Fair. And that fair coincides with the 250th anniversary of the city of Monterey. And they're just, I don't think, could have been a more perfect visual to go along with this. They titled it Fiesta. It's again based on one of the murals that's at the Trotter Gallery that had been up at the Drake Wilshire Hotel. And of course, what happened was the fair was canceled about 2 weeks ago. I think they're going to use it again in 2021. So I have my fingers crossed. And getting back to one of the first images I showed you of the postcard of the two little bears, unbeknownst to me, this had been cast. This is one of the two that were in the postcard where we saw the plasters. And I was able to acquire it for the Jo Mora Trust, and now is in the archive. And I actually used the original 1915 bronze to make a small edition that are available for sale. So if you're a Cal Bear or UCLA Bruin, that may be sacrilegious to offer it that way to both of you, but I do have these. And I'm going to throw out another crazy idea. But before I do that, the image on the left is the Mission San Gabriel. And 2 days ago, the mission was pretty much destroyed by fire. At least the entire ceiling was. I hope they can maintain, the credibility of the walls and that it could be rebuilt. It's unclear what caused the fire, last I heard, but again, it's this kind of unpredictable connection of all this stuff that had some connection to Jo Mora. So this was one of the missions he stopped at on his El Camino Real trip. It also happens to be where he was married to his wife in 1907. And so we have this kind of two ways. And in closing, I've been trying to get Jo Mora nominated and elected to the California Hall of Fame for many years. And so if you're interested in writing a letter of support, if you happen to know the governor or the first partner, I encourage you to do so. I have a wide range of letters from people that are in the file. They look at the file every year. So far, I've been through 2 governors, neither of whom have chosen Jo for the Hall of Fame, but I just throw that out there thinking that some of you may be important influencers. And thank you, and questions. And I have permission to share the fact that a new edition of the book that the book club published is coming out in March of 2021. Published by Gibbs Smith in Utah, and we are working on it as of today. It will be basically the same in terms of the content. However, this second edition provided an opportunity to include some additional visuals in it and to do some kind of updates on information that's come to me in the last year since the book, well, not even a full year yet, but since the original book was published. And so if you're interested in this, this is the $30 price point book. It's a dust jacketed hardback when it first comes out. And it will be on the Gibbs Smith website theoretically in September, but if you would like me to add you to the notification list, there's my email list at the bottom. And I turn it back to Kevin.
Well, thanks. That was great. We're a little over our 6:15 cutoff time, but we do have, I think there's 1 or 2 questions that maybe you could quickly answer for us.
Yes.
We had a question. Did Jo Mora know Maynard Dixon?
Yes, he did. I don't know if their paths actually crossed, but I do know that they exchanged letters. And it had to do with kind of the state of affairs in Arizona with the Hopi when they were going through some tribal strife. But yes, and I think they would have known each other from the Bohemian Club as well. They were kind of in San Francisco at the same time.
Sure. That's the only question. There's some other well-wishers here in the chat. Here's another question. Where is the building in downtown San Francisco with the B of A building in the background that was repurposed and has a history room?
It's in the first or second block of Bush. So very close to Montgomery, I think. Just maybe a block or two up from Montgomery on Bush, if I'm remembering correctly.
Mm-hmm. And you showed us some, I think, dioramas that are out in Oklahoma. Do you know where they are in Oklahoma?
Yes. Yes, the Will Rogers dioramas are at the Will Rogers Memorial in Claremore, Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. And then I showed you one of the heroic sculptures. Those are at, I'm blanking, those in Bartlesville. Those are in Bartlesville.
Great. We had a couple of questions about those dioramas, so very popular in the Q&A. And there's one other question which we'll get to before we can wrap up here. Were there other artists, colleagues, and compatriots of Mora's who thought highly of his work?
Well, that's an intriguing question. I mentioned E.A. Burbank, and so they lived together. It was Burbank's work. Burbank documented numerous tribes of the American Indians, and he did it in a very recognizable style, a lot of which was these Conte crayon portraits. And it's interesting because Jo did a couple of portraits in the very same style. And my sense is that he maybe just challenged himself to do it, to see if he could do it like Burbank did it. Because Burbank was a little more established as an artist at the time. And I think Jo just kind of challenged himself. And in fact, side by side, you couldn't tell the difference. I mean, Jo was that technically acute. So that's an example. There were other artists in Monterey that Jo, I know, knew. He was one of the founding members of the Carmel Art Association. And so there were people that he probably worked with and befriended. There isn't a lot of documentation of that, which is kind of frustrating. I wish there was more. But he was there at the time of Robinson Jeffers, Lincoln Steffens, and some important people in the history of Carmel. And Jo, I'm sure that they all knew each other. It was just such a small town that you couldn't not know each other. But he so much of his life was concerned and centered around creating his artwork that he didn't have a lot of time. I mean, I say that after showing you he acted in plays, he played softball, but his focus was on his artwork, and his style never really varied based on current trends. He lived through Cubism, and post-impressionism, surrealism. I mean, I know he knew about this, but it never swayed his own artistic vision. He never got on anybody else's coattails and quality, or as far as style and type of work that he did.
Right. Did you want to tell anybody about your Thursday performance that you have coming up?
Well, I'm doing another webinar on Thursday, thanks to an invitation from the Art Deco Society in Sacramento. And we've gathered actually 4 organizations together now: the Art Deco, the Renaissance Society, the Book Collectors of Sacramento, and the Sacramento History Society, or Historical Society. So if you're a member of any of those, you probably got an invitation. If you're not, I suspect you could go to their website and ask to be included. It will be similar but different on Thursday.
So for those of you who just can't get enough of Jo Mora and Peter Hiller, track him down on Thursday. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah.
And thank you, everyone, for attending this Book Club of California program. Please join us for our next online program, which is Tales of Iconic San Francisco Foods and the American Dreamers Behind Them, on Monday, July 20th, 1 week from today, from 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. This will be a live presentation by Laura Borman. She's a writer and an editor, and you can register for this event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs email that you may be receiving from the book club. So thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone for joining us. Everybody have a wonderful evening, be well, and stay safe.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye now.